Let's go ahead and begin the webinar then. My name is Eric Frank here at IA Marketing. I'm pleased to welcome you all to our webinar, including those within IA, at our friends at Freeman and our friends and clients calling in. We really appreciate you joining us. Here at IA, we are participating in our third annual EGD Week. This is a week-long celebration of the EGD expertise in which we do activities around our offices and to the external audience to celebrate our expertise in the world of EGD. Please be sure to check out our Instagram page at IA Architects if you wish to compete in our external-facing social contest in which you can win great prizes, including Pantone-themed gifts. Make sure that your account is public for the contest if you wish to join. Now, to introduce today's topic, IA is the largest employee-owned global architecture firm focused on interiors in the world. Freeman is a leading provider of integrated services for experiential marketing, specializing in event management and marketing. Today's presentation is about the juxtaposition of the process and outcomes of our two experiential design services. The presenters will discuss the similarities and differences in bringing a brand to life in a permanent versus a more temporal, almost pop-up outcome. To begin, our first speaker is Chad Finken, who is an experiential design director here at IA. He focuses on elevating design through narrative. He places emphasis on user experience strategies. Chad has leveraged his industry experience and fine arts background to create immersive built environments for a wide range of clients, including the American Red Cross, McDonald's, and Bank of America. Also joining us is Lila Marty, experiential graphic designer at IA. She likes to say that she likes to geek out on all things design. She is passionate about finding the connections between content and environments, and her work is rooted in exploration, iteration, open dialogue, and determination. Lastly, we have Stephen Kellogg joining us, who brings 20+ years of experience leading design teams and clients through the world of branded environments. He has collaborated with clients such as Caterpillar, McDonald's, Allstate, and SAP. His favorite part of the industry is the opportunity to design innovative experiences that fulfill the true vision of the client's brand. We'll hear from each of our speakers, and we will be holding time at the end for a Q&A session. If you look on your right-hand side, unless you've adjusted your box, there should be a chat box that gives you the option to send questions to panelists and organizers. You'll use that to send questions to us. Any questions we aren't able to answer during the course of the webinar, we'll be sure to follow up with, or you can send them directly to info@interiorarchitects.com. With that, I will hand it off to Chad to kick off the presentation. Thank you, Chad.
Thank you. Thanks for joining, everyone. Thank you, Eric, for the clear introduction. So again, my name is Chad Finken, experiential graphic design director, and this is EGD week, and we refer to it as EGD because experiential graphic design is a bit of a mouthful. So it's really kicking off this idea of built environment. So I'll jump past here and really jump in. I know Eric talked a little bit about IA, and our practice is really about, our EGD group is really about, it's a service line that's built in into the 22 offices that IA has, but it's really about our bread and butter is corporate workplace. So we have the ability to inform design, creating these experiences. We've got 8 different locations that are 8 different offices that we have presence in, but it's really about making sure that it's an integrated and a fully immersive environment.
Sure, and a little bit brief about Freeman. So we are the largest brand experience company, and it is a 90-year-old company. It's family owned, and truly grew up as a global service or general contracting service firm, and then has recently, in the past, I would say decade or so, has been leading also the agency services and creative services around live events. And we'll get into the scale of what those projects mean in regard to this idea of architecture and interior design, and then applying those principles again across the different project types to live events that only exist for a certain amount of time. And that's where truly Freeman's expertise lies, is in creating those experiences in a live, branded, immersive format.
Great.
So I and Freeman are similar in the sense that we both work with a built environment to express a client's brand. It essentially all boils down to people and creating memorable experiences for them. It's about how we impact at varying scales with our design and how we work in those varying scales. Today, we're going to look at those through the lens of brand, culture, and process. The beautiful thing is that all of these categories are connected and influence one another in how we deliver that branded experience. So we'll just dive right in. First category is brand, and we're going to talk about how we use brand, specifically how does IA approach this idea of brand and integrating it into space. So in our industry, we are not creating a brand, but rather we are working to understand the company's brand. That doesn't mean we need to just know how a logo or brand assets are used. Rather, it's how is a company perceived both internally and externally. Their space should reflect who they are in every single way. And our goal is to understand all of those pieces and parts.
Yeah. So for instance, in the past, I've worked with, organizations like the Red Cross or the Girl Scouts who are, both have a very similar mission as far as they exist to help people, the nonprofit world, but they've also got storied histories and they're very familiar brands. I mean, everyone knows both of those organizations, but it's really like the way that those brands are expressed in space are very different. So it's really our goal through this is to partner with those groups, because we have a very extensive amount of research that we put into these projects, and we can only get so far. So it's really important that we partner with the organization to make sure that we take our hard work to the table, meet with them, and then work together to co-create to make sure that they get the most robust brand experience possible. And at the same time, working with a partnership, and you're going to hear this word a lot, having a partnership with our internal teams, because interior architects is very much about the interior design. We need to make sure that we have partnerships with our internal teams to make sure that we are blurring that line between EGD and interior design. So I want to make sure that these are fully immersed and fully integrated.
And I think the idea of partnership is truly critical, especially when we're talking about, the built environment, whether that's a permanent space or a temporary space, in the sense that, when we're working with large corporations, and I'll use SAP as an example, we are also not only with the client themselves, but with their agency partners as well. So they have Siegel and Gale managing their corporate brand and global, almost external voice. And so while we're not developing that from scratch, what we're doing is partnering with them to develop a communication piece within that brand for very specific either conferences or elements that we're designing to. But in the end, that partnership and that vision that we're sharing and creating together is truly the only measure or the only way we're going to get to a successful end product. And so, again, it's kind of like, how do we help them deliver that brand message in a different format, utilizing all of the tools that they have at their disposal.
Mm-hmm.
Another aspect of this is a lot of our clients have different levels or hierarchy of brand as far as like campaigns and marketing, and now we're bringing in that sense of space and really being experts in that. Our typical project is a workplace environment, and we're usually tasked with creating spaces that allow a brand to evolve. It needs to be timeless because people are living and working in this space for multiple years potentially, and going in and seeing something every day, you want it to feel as though it's timeless. So we approach it a little bit differently in this sense, and we try to be thoughtful about how we brand these moments inside of the spaces so they can have longevity, or they can adapt with the brand as the brand grows. For example, we think about McDonald's and how back in the day they had Ronald and really playing up that part of McDonald's, and now they've evolved into a more modern take, and they're not only do their restaurants look different, but also their headquarters look different. So we are a part of that and changing that and making sure that their headquarters can be flexible over the next 10 years again.
It's really, and again, that goes to be with the partnership. That wasn't a direction from us. It was just understanding the client, knowing the way that they were taking the business. So being able to make sure that we're thinking forward in that instance.
And I think this is one of the aspects that we can track through this conversation, and you'll hear a lot about permanent versus temporary. So this ability to, when you dig into the vision or the timelessness of a brand in regard to a corporate or a corporation, there are certain elements that are core values. But when you're dealing with live events, this brand immersion can certainly take a different sort of kind of direction in a sense where it's okay to be maybe a little more playful within a temporary exhibition of that brand, because you're not necessarily solidifying that message forever. You're also not creating a space that, to Lila's point, you're going to spend 8-10 hours a day for several years. We're creating experiences that you might spend a matter of hours at best in. And so the ability to be, again, a little more playful, show different potential avenues of that brand. And then it's also driven by the metrics of what you want to get out of that experience as well. So social, so the image there, what's on screen is again, how do you socially activate these events to continue that brand message forward, which is much more along the lines of marketing versus the permanent, I think, kind of value statement that a corporation has.
Sure. So we want to talk a little bit about our approach. And we have a very thoughtful approach to each project. We really want to make sure that through that partnership we work together and we co-create that design narrative, because we really want to extract these authentic brand stories for each organization. And they're all different. They're all they can be any sort of story, whether if it's a story about innovation, it could be a story about diversity, it could be about philanthropy, but really understanding what those stories are and how we can take those and think about sequencing when it comes into a space. So we do work, our expertise is workspace, but we think about the sequencing, even arriving to the building. How is that different than when you walk off the elevators, and thinking about how people are sequencing through a space, almost like a tour path in a way, and making sure that we're very thoughtful about that before we even dive into what things exactly look like. We become mini experts.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the critical component of all of this. In order to create a holistic approach, it does start with the deep research into them as a company, what they're truly trying to accomplish with each one of these projects, and then take that set of design drivers or principles or metrics that we're trying to create value against, and then start to break that down and look at it across that entire event landscape. So to Chad's point, it does have a beginning and an end, and I think the different project types have different kind of critical elements in what that means. While if someone's going to come into a space and leave that space, but they're going to do it again and again on a daily basis, that's certainly a different way to think about that
Absolutely.
Kind of experience when you have someone engaging in an environment. They're there for 2 hours and they will never step foot in that environment again. And so it's critical for each one of these project types to really, I think, communicate those that right type of content and context, but also knowing that the last thing that they do, touch, feel, or see truly, I think, embeds that impression of the experience to them. So it's, especially when you have a very small timeline, it's critical to get those moments right and to leave on a positive note, because that's what they carry with you. And again, that's an extension of their brand. And I feel like all of those things working together is how we start to define what is the culture, not only of the company, but of these experiences.
Sure. And when diving into the culture, we start to think about the target audience. So I mean, it really boils down. We talk about the experience, and without people, there's no experience, right? So it's really about the individuals. So this idea of we look at the employees, both current employees, potential employees, and how do those sequences differ? Because a current employee is going to see it again in our line of business. They're going to see that multiple times, every day, 5 days a week. Hopefully that's it. But being able to see that versus how does that differ for potential clients or external visitors? So we want to make sure that we understand all the users that are going to be using a space, but then creating a hierarchy. So saying, here are the spaces that are going to be more externally facing. Here are spaces that may be more internally facing, because we want to basically set up and map this journey for everyone. So then we can start to really understand where these big impact stories and where they can occur.
I think the audience type is also an interesting, a little bit of a division between the project types, in the sense that within, say, a headquarters space that both Chad and Lila deal with, they're looking at both a recruit, an executive, people there on a daily basis, visitors, and that type of thing. And so you're trying to, there's a lot of individual paths. And within the live event industry, there's very large categories of audiences, and then we break them down. But a business-to-business event, then you're dealing with your clients. If it's a completely internal event, you're strictly dealing with employees. And so it's kind of, you're either introducing people to a brand and content, or you're almost or embedding the brand back into the culture themselves. So you're working for a company, it's certainly a brand building event, and can be 100% internal, or it's directly to clients, or it's directly to businesses that sell your products to clients. And then the divisions that we break down between that and start to guide experiences within, larger corporate events, especially, I think is truly important.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the really fascinating things about when talking about the target audience with Stephen and how some of these events play out is he started to talk about, like, for instance, for McDonald's, it was all internal and thinking about the franchisee, like the owner operators, and how those events versus something like the Salesforce, which Dreamforce you had mentioned, is this big, huge event that's just all externally facing. And that to me is fascinating because that's totally different than how we work, but overall the approach is the same.
Yeah, it is, and the design or the vision that creates the design by extension is truly different. So when it's 100% internal, it's kind of interesting that it's obviously even a little more private, and so even how you can market for these types of events certainly change because there's a lot of proprietary information you would have when you're getting all of the thousands and thousands of franchisees of McDonald's around the world in one place, versus SAP's flagship event, which is truly a B2B event, and they're bringing in their clients, but then also their leadership teams and their content teams as well. So the engagement certainly kind of moves back and forth between those two.
And I think beyond, the target audience, another big factor in a company's culture is their personality. And this is how they identify themselves as an organization, how they see themselves and where they want to be. So for example, we've worked with a sports marketing group, and we've also worked with financial service firm. And one has a race car in their lobby, and the other one might be celebrating their heritage in their lobby. So because of the type of work they do, the personality of the company is slightly different, which then inherently makes our design approach and the design solutions different. So in both cases, our goal is to really push the design boundaries and help these organizations move forward. And only through that idea of partnership and asking the right questions can we do this, in the hopes that it provides an unexpected design solution that still talks to who they are, still on brand, but really celebrates them.
It allows us to really ask those questions up front,
Right.
knowing, and Lila had mentioned the sports marketing agency, this idea of, we knew the look and feel they were going for, and then moving to the West Loop, and having this race car, like how can we push that? How can we play with that and have that be even more, more robust than what was in their old space? So bringing their personality to life is an important one.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about brand and culture, obviously these things are inextricable. You can't have one without the other, but to specifically highlight personality, especially within the live event industry, I feel like is another, potentially interesting avenue that we get to explore maybe a little more, where we can take maybe more hidden aspects of a brand's personality and start to amplify that within a smaller, more temporary event where it's okay to be funny or abstract or just even a little bit irreverent potentially, especially when you have a pretty solid corporate brand that people know is very business facing. You want them to be serious because their business is serious, but it's certainly okay to open up and start to, I think, allow people to see inside of that personality of that company even more so. And I think I mean, what we're all trying to do is create a multifaceted conversation and truly allowing people to see into that company's, just a little bit of transparency, I think, helps engage with the brand and then allows people to be invested in them as well. And so in this sense of personality, you're able to look at in different elements that we're designing for certainly engage different types of audiences. And so they'll, maybe they want to look at engaging with a younger crowd. That personality of that engagement is going to be different than an executive level summit or something. So tailoring those conversations and by extension those designs, I think is part of the fun aspect of what we get to do on a daily basis.
Sure. And the conversations is a big one. A lot of times when it comes into embedding stories into a space, we try to take an approach where we can have a story baked in and that it isn't something that's super obvious when you walk up, but it's a conversation piece. So it's strengthening those connections between people as they walk through a space. So if it's recruits, et cetera, but being able to play around with that and add to their history while it, again, can remain more in the timeless with the overlap there. We're going back and forth. Cool. So we also talk about location, and location's a big factor. You think about celebrating geography in some capacity is often, really important with the environment. And, you can think about the same client and how different is that as far as being able to bring in some locally inspired design just to really celebrate where they are. I mean, how different is an organization that's based in New York versus their location that's in, California? Is one a little bit more laid back than the other? Great question. That's one of the things we ask about. But I think we have the ability to, through the architectural concept and working through the EGD, the experience, we have the ability to maintain or create 100% custom solution for clients to make sure that it feels very authentic to them, very authentic to the mission, the vision, but also has that local flair to it. Whether that's, bringing in local artists or references in some capacity or, materiality and that kind of thing.
I think there's also another really interesting kind of take on location is that you can have the same company with multiple offices across, the United States, and each location has a little bit different of a personality just based on where they are. And so when we're designing the spaces, the values are the same, their mission is the same, their logo, brand colors, all of those elements are the same, but we like to infuse some of the culture through location and, taking inspiration because it's just, people are slightly different per place. And that's, I think a great way to sort of flex design and a brand while still staying holistic and feeling like if you go to one office, it feels the same as the other, but there are moments and touches of separation that are special and unique to them.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say that this is where we become a little more jealous of the spaces you're able to create an emote brand within because, and I'll talk about location in a few different aspects in regard to our industry because we share the same common desire where we'll work on a global account and have multiple events throughout the year that immerse people into that brand. And certainly the geography that they're in plays a role. And so the event that we would have in the States versus the event we would have in China, obviously targeting different audiences, but the message and the content and context you want to be very similar. And the ability to walk into an event in Austin or, to use your example, New York as well, certainly they should be of the same brand and of the same ilk where, they're foundationally the same, but would you have the same sort of engagement or show, look, and feel in Austin as opposed to New York? I think the geography plays a huge role into how we're extending or initiating those conversations. And so regionality plays a huge role into our work as well. But what I think is, and again, this is where the jealousy of space comes into play, where we're also using existing buildings and structures. So we're kind of guided where we don't necessarily build to suit each environment. We come into environments and manipulate them to speak to a brand. And if you think about the locations that can even handle some of these larger events, those are even specific to very large cities like Las Vegas or Orlando, where they have convention centers and hotel rooms even. So the city has to accommodate some of these things too. And so we're almost driven by location out of necessity versus a built to suite option. And if you can imagine trying to create a brand look and feel against the backdrop of, casino carpet and wallpaper, which is very common in Las Vegas, then you're also trying to design on top of an existing design. And so the challenge there is that location can drive an aesthetic that you're either trying to work with and leverage, or you're trying to work against and sort of mask. But still, you're also trying to create that same level of similar nature in regard to that brand engagement. And I think that's also part of and we'll get into the process next, where we have such a similar background and research process up to the design part and how we implement that. It's just once we get into how we do it and where, it certainly starts to divide.
Yeah. So let's hop into how we do it. This is the one where there's tons of variables because, again, location, scale, etc. But really thinking about, our process is pretty streamlined at IA. We've developed this 5-step process, which is this idea of understand, assess, develop, implement, and then evaluate. And it's all set up and it's structured to where the EGD team works in this fashion, the interior design team works in this fashion, the strategy team, like all of our business lines work, and they may be staggered, but this idea where we all understand where people are along the process. So understanding is really the research and the partnering. Assess is really developing these concepts and the partnering aspect of it in the strategic approach, and then really the develop goes into this idea of we work in 3 dimensions because that's our world is 3 dimensions. So trying to, whether it's sketches, quick ideation to get ideas across. So really establishing design drivers up front and making sure that we have there are guide rails.
Right. It's another kind of part of our process is that we are taking into consideration brand, location, culture, those things we talked about earlier. And from that, we build a strategic framework to develop a narrative that informs the decisions made throughout the project. So it's almost like Chad said, it's almost like a roadmap as we're moving through. At the very beginning in the schematic design phase, we have it, and at the very end, when we're going through fabrication installation, we still have that to use as reference and make sure we're achieving that vision from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say our process is, and this is where we link very well in the sense that we're trying to do the same thing, is have a very beneficial and robust discovery process, so we can level set, create essentially something to give back to the client before we start designing and say, is this right? Are we tracking in the right way, trying to accomplish the right things? And I think our structures are the same in that process sense, where we're kind of starting at the end. What do we need to measure? What kind of experience do we want them to have? And then we work backwards and start there. And then it goes from, very similar process. It's a discovery, kind of a conceptual design, a development beyond that, and then it gets into a technical process. I think one of the things, and so we have all of those tools that we do, but at different kind of scales in the sense as well, just in regard to time frame and everything else.
Perfect transition. The next part we want to talk about is scale. And like we mentioned before, there are a ton of variables when it comes to individual projects and clients. But one of the big things we have to think about is how scale changes our design thinking and our approach.
Sure. And thinking about, really to illustrate this point, thinking about a floor plan, right? And how do we approach a single floor versus what if you add multiple floors and it goes vertical and it winds up being a stack of 6 floors, let's say. And then how do you approach that if that stack of 6 floors is actually one of 8 buildings on a campus? So we need to really be thoughtful about that. Is the campus in the middle of a city? Is it out? Is it more of a pastoral, environment? So thinking about that and being able to, we need to be able to scale, scale up, but at the same time, we also need to be able to scale down. So it may not be a floor plan. What if it's it could be a amenity space refresh or a lobby refresh. So we need to be able to think about, we need to be flexible when it comes to that. So it's hard to, there's like we said, tons of variables, and it's something that we deal with all the time.
Well, and in addition to that, there's the scale of the overall project size, but there are also things that we have to consider, like the scale of the touch points that are experienced
Sure.
within that space, right? So how do we engage people at different levels and different impact levels? So, we try to use a unique, sharp focus on these details to make that experience really special. And so we think about how we can elevate, anything from a small room code sign all the way to a large immersive experience, or a low tech, high touch, interactive or digital display, so we're thinking about the different levels in that scale with inside of the space as well, and trying to engage people, through the same process, but at different scales.
And I think the idea of scaling that process is great, because in the end, you want people to have that transformational and immersive experience. But starting with how do you do that for a 10 by 10 exhibit, which is, very common in our industry, in a sense that, you have 100 square feet to immerse someone in a brand and you only have a couple hours, versus a 1 million square feet where we're trying to, move thousands and thousands of people around, tens of thousands of people around a show floor, and trying to engage them at different levels of education, brand, content, networking, and be able to facilitate all of those actions within that space. And so the idea that and scaling that process in regard to, I think value of that brand experience as well, but starting with the right tools in the very beginning, regardless of what scale the outcome is certainly important. And, I think it's just how many other factors are you laying on top of that. So 1 million square feet means you're also dealing with, how are people experience throughout the day. You're also dealing with food and beverage, how are they being accommodated throughout their day in regard to, they also need a place to take a break, and do the things that people would normally do throughout their day, and then also engage on a show floor that's just filled with, activity that can sometimes seem overwhelming and chaotic. So it's kind of interesting when you look at the scale of the event from the customer's point of view or the attendee point of view, it can be very overwhelming and distracting to walk into a space that is just so enormous with so much going on, that in those cases, we also need to break down the scale in components on the show floor as well. So people can have those different kinds of engagement, certainly get a spot to rest for a couple seconds, because you're on your feet all day. And so accommodating that type of human engagement at the different scales of these projects is something we're also factoring in on a day-to-day basis.
And the scale of a concert.
Go
on.
What's that?
I was just going to say the scale of a concert is much different than anything that I've ever designed, but that's pretty impressive.
Well, yeah, and if you think about the life cycle of one of our larger events, it does go from the scale of a concert where they would even have an opening ceremony, they'll have the show, and then a closing ceremony. So it's possible to have 2 concerts, the show, food and beverage for 30,000 people, and also trying to inspire them. So
sure,
it's all over the place.
Well, since we talk about schedule and lifespan, we can jump into this. So it's, again, good transition. I think being able to, way back when I used to say, I think a tip, when someone would say a typical schedule, I would say about a year. it's not so cut and dry. It really depends on, again, the scale of the project. I mean, is it going to be, again, a lobby refresh? Is this going to be a tower that could take up multiple years? So it's really understanding that. But I think the biggest thing is really thinking about, in our world, is, the clients are committing to leases. So if they're committing to, let's say, moving into a space for 10 years, we need to design to that, because we need to make sure that it functions properly. It's, again, got the timelessness factor built in to where, as their brand evolves or as the business changes, that we're working that in to make sure that that experience doesn't fall flat down the road. So
this idea of schedule, and I like that you mentioned leases, because especially when you're talking about a large event, there are literally only certain places in the world that you can hold this scale of an event. And so you're almost on a timeshare. So it's very common in our industry to have, 3-year contracts or multiple year contracts with these event centers or conference centers. And so you are essentially getting into a lease in a very similar fashion. But it's more of a timeshare model where you're coming in, you're only able to use it for a certain amount of days of those years, and then you're coming back out, and it's, you leave it as you found it, essentially. So it's got to go up and come back down, all within an instant. And that's, you mentioned a year might be sort of a typical timeline, because you're also waiting for construction to happen and all of those other kind of factors that are wrapped around that project type. I would say 6 to 8 months would be our longest project from start to finish. And that's from that discovery phase to building that 1 million square feet. So that's our largest project currently. And we'll start, at some point in September for a show in May, but you also have to back out the fabrication time in that, which, and so essentially it's even a more truncated time frame. And then we'll also do several projects where it's more of a pop-up experience, and you'll have a couple weeks to do that exact same process, discovery and concept design, getting through approvals and design or fabrication through that, and installation. So I think that is also an interesting difference between our work, is just the fact that we'll have probably many more smaller versions of what that final project will be leading up to that event.
And I think one of the things that I found really just through our conversations is knowing that you talk about because we think about our construction schedule being, depending on the scale of the project, 12 plus weeks or, months and moving on. But like when it comes down to some of your events, you mentioned, Stephen, your like a typical build event and then breakdown. Like that's fascinating to me. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I just got back from Las Vegas last night. We had 2 shows open in the past couple of weeks, and these are, I would say, smaller tier 1 shows. Are probably for around 4,000 to 5,000 people, and a show like that takes up, maybe 250,000 square feet. We're given, I think, on the high end, potentially 4 days to 4.5 days, depending on when you can move in.
Wow.
From a concrete floor, you're bringing in crates and boxes. So they started installation on a Friday afternoon, and by Tuesday morning, the show's open. And then if it's a 2-day event and it ends on Wednesday evening, they're starting to break that down. And by Thursday evening, it's probably all gone again. And so it's incredible, the logistics. And I feel like that's where, Freeman, having done this for 90 years, is such a master at it. It takes an army of people to work against logistics in that sense, and shipping and transportation and getting things on and off into a complicated event space, regardless. And so the 1 million square feet, for example, we have an enormous time frame of 3 weeks to build that 1 million square feet, and then it probably takes maybe 4 days to break that space back down. It's a very interesting difference coming from the architectural industry.
Sure.
I don't think we envy you on that one.
No, you shouldn't. You absolutely should not. But it's exciting. It's kind of like, you talk about the idea of this concert. It is a little bit like a Broadway play where it's, it goes from nothing. It is created, and then it goes back down. And just with all the, you start to think about lighting and structure and sound and all of these things. It's interesting.
That's great. It's cool. Okay. So as Freeman and IA, we started talking and we started to talk about projects and our process and all these kind of things. We realized that it's funny, we have a lot of overlap with some of our clients. We have a similar client base just across the board for both organizations, and this is just a few of them. But really, we do have this unique opportunity to help impact people and organizations by creating these memorable experiences or memorable moments that can really leverage that. And I think the big piece is that clients are leveraging design to enhance their brand through experience at all levels.
And I love that this, when Chad and I were talking, we did discover that we are working with many of the same clients and client types. A lot of Fortune 100 brands and corporations look to engage design firms at these different experience levels or types of experiences. And so the ability to work with a design team to create a visionary environment that needs to last and be a daily engagement with a brand is certainly a different kind of design process from how are you going to engage the world in 2 days or the top execs or clients. But equally important to create those design partnerships. And I think that's one of the really fun things that, when we're going back and forth and kind of talking about these things, it's that very similar process, very different outcomes, and different communication points too, because we might be more on that external marketing voice end of those types of projects, whereas you are truly defining culture that does need to last beyond just a couple hours, and the complications within that certainly have its own, set of challenges and rewards in that sense.
Absolutely.
And it certainly takes a million different forms, as you can see.
For sure. I mean, we're just going through all this information and thinking about like all these different touch points and how impactful it can be really speaks to what we do. And I think experience is pivotal in any of these environments.
Well, thank you guys for a fantastic webinar. We really appreciate it. I wanted to open the floor to questions now at this time, and we certainly have more we can talk about. We have one question ready from Martha, and just a quick review. If you look at your chat box, you should be able to select the drop down and aim questions at us. So I'll start off with the first question we have from Martha, which was that she was curious how you would extend the brand experience into an internal SKO or kickoff if you're wanting to promote the brand and help everyone buy in as brand ambassadors. And if we need clarification, we invite Martha to send us more messages regarding that. But do we have a response from the team regarding that question?
Could you phrase it one more time? I just want to make sure I heard it right.
The SKO?
Yeah.
Yeah, which I believe is shorthand for the kickoff meeting, basically. So internal meetings. So the sales kickoff, Martha clarified.
I see what you're saying. I think that's really interesting. Obviously, there's prep work to be done at every level. And I think that's where culture plays a big part into this. If it's a very in-depth internal meeting, obviously the subject matter, the context, all of that is really important. But it's also, I think, one of the interesting things, and we just had an internal conference ourselves, is giving people the ability to almost separate themselves from their company as well. So do you move it off-site? I think is really important to give people an ability to kind of like give themselves the white space and the headspace to truly engage in potentially new information and to also inspire them. And, we've done several engagements where you are branding the environment, but it is much more of an aspirational view of that brand internally. But you're certainly not marketing back into the company. So it's sort of a different idea of look and feel, I guess I would say.
Yeah. And I mean, at IA, we engage in vision sessions and those kind of parts and pieces with kickoffs to make sure that we're asking questions, and to Stephen's point, where it's maybe getting them out of their normal realm. So starting to ask questions, and totally for example, like if you were a hotel, what kind of hotel would you be? Just to start to get them thinking about themselves in a different light, to help us start to craft those stories around or how they see themselves or how they see themselves going forward. That's just part of our process in the engagement portion.
Martha says, thanks. I know that we've been getting a lot of questions as a firm, as a whole, regarding these Instagrammable moments, and certainly seeing varying degrees in which clients are making that intentional. How does that kind of forcing itself into, because I'd imagine it'd be a very different treatment between Lila and Chad and what Stephen is seeing. Could anyone speak to that?
Yeah, I think for us, again, going back to that idea of flexibility. So if you want a moment in your office space to be Instagrammable, it might be that our approach is slightly different, knowing that what is Instagrammable now might be different later. So giving that flexibility to how we fabricate, how we design. Also, I think our goal is less Instagrammable and more memorable, where it kind of strikes a nerve in somebody that feels like they have a connection to maybe an installation or a message that causes them to want to document it in some way, rather than with Stephen's world, it might be slightly different.
Yeah, I mean the photo that was shown previously with like the bathtub and the rubber duckies floating and that feels more like a setting or a scene, but it's hard for us to think about real estate in that way because they're paying for clients are paying for real estate. So again, if we can find moments that are memorable visually, that are visually stunning, that people look at them and say, wow, I'm at this organization, I want to get a photo in front of this. That's great, but we don't go in thinking we need to find an Instagrammable moment, right? It just kind of works its way into the space.
And I would say our scope of work almost quite literally includes social activations where they explicitly desire these elements to create, the ability to share across social media, because then that's also engaging the brand in a different way. And so then they're able to connect both those experiences to that current brand messaging and kind of get that out there. And it can be silly, it can be fun, especially when it's temporary versus, you wouldn't necessarily have a bathtub in the lobby of a headquarters building, but it's appropriate when it's only going to be there for a couple hours and you're trying to get a campaign message across along with this sort of immersion or transformation into a brand. So we're constantly being asked to create those very impactful, very fun, creative, sometimes frivolous, and even abstract moments, because that is part of the strategy, is to create that marketing platform and carry that beyond that event, because we only have a few hours to engage. How can you make that event live on beyond that? And so that's the idea of social in our world.
And if it comes to like recruits, et cetera, this idea of being able to extend that or get them to remember something when they came into a space, along with the experience of walking through, but it's just that visual that sticks with them.
I would imagine even in, so Chad and Lila, your world, where if there are those fun and frivolous moments, that they're also needing to be designed where they can also be updated. And so the idea of evolving a brand in a permanent space is also just as important as how we can use the temporary space to continue that messaging.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, I know we alluded to working with, I think tying back to the community aspect of the presentation, we alluded to maybe working with local artists. I'm wondering if we could, speak to an example, and hopefully everyone here could speak to an example of where that happened and maybe the benefits that it actually brought. Because, from the broader context, yes, we want to create a connection with the community, but I have a feeling some folks attending the webinar might be asking, okay, well, you've got this connection to community. What are you going to do with it? Where's the ROI there?
Sure. So we have a client in the West Loop who is they are investors in agricultural innovation groups, or folks that are invested in helping the environment. And we actually engaged in their cafe. We engaged with a local artist that they had worked with previously, or they had seen his work previously down in, I think it was Alabama. But they wanted to bring this big, large expression into their space. And I think the really great thing about that, he happened to be local and he worked down at Columbia. So I was able to engage with him and get him his name was Rob Funderburg, and I was able to sit down with him and talk about the concepts and how the space was evolving and being able to work through that. And I think there's a really great story in that, to where he was able to come up with concepts that aligned with our concept. We were able to make sure that, you know, colors aligned and all that kind of a thing, and work through a lot of this together, which I think wound up being a really, you know, huge moment for the client, because it's a story that they can tell, because it relates to them. It's not his own, you know, he doesn't have a thing that he does. It's more, we talk to the client to start to understand how he can represent the industries they support or that they invest in, to make sure that, but it was also this local aspect to it too, in the West Loop, where you've got this beautiful view of downtown and then, you know, the skyline, et cetera.
Right. And I've worked with clients in the past where, back to this idea of it's the same firm but in different locations, you know, they had similar approaches to maybe 70% of the EGD we put in there. And then the other percent, you know, they really wanted to make it feel custom and special to them. So bringing in that local aspect or a local artist allows to flex in different ways and celebrate their community in different ways, and you know, feature elements that are unique to where they are and who they are. So having that ability to have a local connection, I think, is great. And a lot of, you know, we've seen a lot of clients wanting that and kind of seeking that out.
Yeah, and even most recently, so Harley Davidson had one of their annual dealer meetings, and it was in Milwaukee this year. So, you know, back to sort of their roots. And it was really important to bring that regional aspect into the show as well. You know, it's where they started, you know, and many of those dealers come back to the show every year. You know, it's cyclical for them, and so it's interesting to design for the same audience. And being able to engage and represent what Milwaukee means to that company was a really interesting take. And the client brought in local Milwaukee graffiti artists, and we sort of allowed space within the show floor to just be kind of taken over by them, and add that layer of, again, personality and connection to, you know, not only the local market, but it's just something fun for the audience to engage in a different way versus we have, you know, we're trying to accomplish so much on the show floor. Is it okay that people are just having fun staring at this beautiful piece of artwork or graffiti or installation? And that, again, adds that layer to where you're having multiple contexts within one thing, but it's all very tied back to the brand and experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's this sense of ownership when you can do that. You can find ways to integrate opportunities like that, whether it be ownership from people on the show floor to ownership of the people using the space or going to this cafe inside of a workplace every day. They know the story behind it. They know, you know, all of the details. And when they come in or they give a tour to a recruit or a client, they have a talking point and a way to connect with those people and a way to celebrate. So it gives them that opportunity, like I said, to have ownership over an element in their space. And it's a pretty amazing thing for those people to feel like their ownership in the space, but also within the company.
Great, and I think that touches back to retention quite a bit and heading back on that ROI. I do ask that our audience consider keeping up to date on our blog. We'll be posting a blog post relatively soon on some of IA's work with artists and how that ties back to our EGD practice. We have 5 minutes until the hour, so just a heads up to all of our attendees who may have to make it to another meeting. With our last 5 minutes, we're going to do a little quick short fire round. I'm going to ask Stephen, followed by Chad, followed by Lila, to name a way, really quick off the cuff, tweets worth of text, you know, or words, how you think the angle of design that you touch the most is going to be impacted by technology in the next couple of years, and what's the most impactful way that's going to happen in regards to how you touch the designs of the spaces you work on?
I think in brief, technology is going to enable us to connect the messages and content beyond that event. So this ability to keep reinforcing those messages, being able to package that content and take it with them, people being able to engage in these events remotely is obviously, you know, something that's being developed even and utilized even more so. So I think it's a way to take those messages before, during, and after and extend that experience.
The thing
All right,
that,
Chad.
yeah, the thing that I love about technology is sure, there's an upfront cost, but there's an opportunity to, we talk about timeless and making sure we don't have things, like being able to incorporate dynamic content, whether that's from a welcoming expression when people come into a space, but something that people it's a discovery moment. It's something that can wow people, but it's also something that can evolve over time. And it's, again, that flexibility built in, I think, is hugely important from a client perspective. As long as we can get somebody that can manage content, which is another challenge, but I think that's something we go into the conversation with, which is good.
And something I think that was actually talked about earlier this week in a separate webinar during EGD week was this idea that we created a digital wayfinding app. So a big thing for us is wayfinding navigation through spaces and making the individual's experience as seamless as possible. And so something we've been seeing and integrating into our work is having signage that is live and that you can work on your app or you can have it on your desktop, and that way you can navigate the space without any hiccups, or so it's in addition to having those code signs, but it's also a new way to feel like you're innovative with inside of a space, but also, to Chad's point, it's flexible in the future. So if you change a room or you change something, that system will change with you. So that's been a new kind of exciting way of integrating digital in a different way for workplace.
Great answers, groups. And Lila was just referencing a webinar we had earlier in the week on mapping user experience. If you're curious as to what happened in that webinar, please visit interiorarchitects.com/webinars on Monday or Tuesday of this upcoming week, and you should be able to get access to the recorded webinar, as well as this one, which will be posted on Monday or Tuesday of next week. And with that, we find ourselves near the end of our hour. I want to thank our panelists for joining us and for lending us some insights. I appreciate it, guys. You did great. And would like to thank our attendees for being a part of this EGD week with us. So be sure to go out to our Instagram account at IA Architects and to be a part of the EGD week celebrations. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Cheers.